Okay, good evening and welcome to this evening's meeting of the Woodbury County Zoning Commission. Today's date is November 28th, 2022, and the time is 6 p.m. Tonight's meeting will be audio taped and minutes will be prepared. In respect to all parties, we ask those present turn off cell phones or set to vibrate. Those in attendance are asked to legibly complete the attendance sheet upon the front table. I would like to take a moment to review the procedures that the commission will follow tonight. First, the commission will handle the normal housekeeping agenda items. Then for each application on the agenda, I will open the public hearing on the item. The planning and zoning staff will then present the staff report, including the staff recommendation. Any letters or other communication received from the public prior to the hearing will be entered into the record. The applicant will then have the opportunity to present his or her case or respond to staff report. Next, we will hear comments from the public. If you'd like to speak either in support of or against the application, you must come to the microphone. Please first state your name and address for the record. All interested parties should be heard, but repetitious comments should be avoided. Repetitious or irrelevant comments may be ruled out of order by the chair. I ask that you remain respectful and courteous with your comments at all times. After all public comments have been heard, the staff and applicant may make a closing statement. The hearing shall then be closed by motion and vote. Thereafter, no further comments from the staff, public, or applicant may be heard unless asked for by the commission. The commission shall then deliberate the case and may ask questions of the applicant, the staff, or any party offering testimony. However, such questions do not reopen the hearing for additional comments from the public unless so requested or approved by the commission. The commission will then formulate and vote on a motion. The motion will typically either grant or deny the requested application. Any commission member who has an ex parte communication to place in the record of this meeting should do so prior to the beginning of the deliberation of the respective agenda item. And the next item then is on the agenda is the roll call. Dan, do you want to help us out with that?
Yeah, if you just want to have the record reflect that all commissioners are present.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is public comment on matters not on the agenda. Do we have any public not on the agenda? Okay, hearing none, we're going to move on to item number 4, which is the approval of the minutes of October 24th, 2022.
I make a motion to approve.
We have a motion. Can I get a second?
I'll second that motion.
All in favor, say aye. All opposed, same sign. Okay. Next item on the agenda is a public hearing, Zonleit's first edition minor subdivision proposal. Dan, will you read into the record the information on this one?
Yes, Furman East Only has filed a one-lot minor subdivision, including parcel number 894227200001. The purpose is to split the house from the farm ground. The proposal has been properly noticed in the Sioux City Journal's legal section on November 12, 2022. The neighbors within 1,000 feet have been duly notified via a November 9th, 2022 letter about the Zoning Commission public hearing on November 28th, 2022 tonight. Appropriate stakeholders, including government agencies, utilities, organizations, have been notified and have been requested to comment. The Woodbury County engineer found the proposal in compliance with Iowa code closure requirements and found that the lot has adequate access to the road system. Extraterritorial review as required by Iowa Code 354.9 was completed by the City of Correctionville on October 10th, 2022. The property is not located in the floodplain. The proposed lot contains both the well and septic system. Based on the information received and the requirements set forth in the zoning and subdivision ordinance, the proposal meets the appropriate criteria for approval. It is the recommendation of staff to approve this proposal.
Okay, do we have Zonleys here tonight? No representing?
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to let us know other than what we have in front of us? Okay. Do we have any questions or comments from any commissioners? I'm not hearing anything. Are you ready to make a motion? Go into closed session. Okay, make a motion to go into closed session. Thank you. Is that a motion?
A motion going to closed session.
We need a second.
I'll second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, we're now in closed session. Now, do we have any comments or are we ready to move on to them?
I'll make a motion to recommend the approval of the Zonley first edition of the Woodbury County Board of Supervisors as proposed.
Okay, you have a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
That has been completed. Motion carried. Okay, we're going to take just a couple of minutes to sign some documents and then we'll be right back. So hang tight. Okay, we're going to get started on the next agenda item, which is a public hearing for the zoning ordinance text amendment for hazardous liquid pipelines. Summary of proposed zoning ordinance text amendment. Dan, do you want to read our information into the record, please?
Yes. Okay. On October 11th, 2022, the Woodbury County Supervisors unanimously approved a motion to direct staff and the zoning commission to initiate a review process and provide a recommendation of a zoning ordinance text amendment to the zoning ordinance to address the permitting of hazard liquidous pipelines. There is already a process in place to address the permitting of pipelines. However, the intent is to review the current process and consider supplemental language to the ordinance that would account for specific separation distances from occupied structures due to concerns about the health and safety of residents being located in close proximity to pipelines. The staff has worked on a report basically that analyzes CO2 pipelines in terms of preparing a literature review, looking at the consequences of situations such as pipeline failures, including the impact to the population, as well as measures local communities can employ for mitigation. The report kind of describes the county's existing conditional use permit procedure and does have a recommendation to look at a setback in terms of 330 feet from residential structures such as single-family dwellings based upon data from the Emergency Response Guidebook, which is the hazard mitigation in terms of the first point of when an incident occurs that residences are brought to during an event. So this recommendation also includes a 50-foot setback from commercial or industrial zoning districts. It is also recommended to institute 1,000-foot planning areas and consultation zones to foster collaboration among landowners, pipeline operators, government officials, and other stakeholders. The other scenario to kind of look at is, as you've all kind of seen in the state of Iowa, the scenario with hazardous liquid pipelines has been quite prominent in the news, and staff is of course looking at various scenarios, including a federal case that was presented on Monday, November 14th in federal court that was filed in the United States District Court for the Southern Jurisdiction of Iowa Central Division between William Cowser and Summit Carbon LLC versus Story County and the Story County Board of Supervisors. The case considers questions of whether local zoning ordinances can be preempted by the federal and state levels of government. At this point, Chairperson, that's what I've got so far. So, absolutely.
Yeah, hang on. So at this point, I think we'll open it up to public comments. So if you want to step forward to the microphone and let us know who you are and what your comment is. We'd like to, because we have so many people here, we'd like to limit your comments to 3 minutes. We might ask questions. It might run a little longer if that's the case, but if you could, please, just in consideration, limit it to 3 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Carol Hennings. We live in rural Woodbury County, but our address is Mobile, Iowa. Do you need any other information?
If you could. Audio's not coming on. If you could state your address for the record.
Okay, 1970 Garner Avenue, Mobile, Iowa. 51039. Okay, I'm going to start it off with a question. Do you have the literature on the gassing of Satatera, Mississippi? It was an explosion of a CO2 pipeline. Have you taken this into consideration?
I think we've seen several articles refer back to that explosion.
Okay. Okay. Now, the CO2 in that case traveled several miles, not just 330 feet. Okay. I just read today an article which was carried out as a scientific experiment, and they timed from the time of the explosion to how far the CO2 cloud went. And it goes approximately 1,500 feet in 4 minutes. So what does that tell you? What it tells me is on our particular piece of property, it borders Buchanan Avenue and Highway 20. We're 1 mile. We're 1 mile from the Sioux City city limits. We don't live there. It's just a property of ours. Okay. So if there are houses, there are houses to the west of us. There's a house right across the road from our border of our property. on Buchanan, and there's also houses to the east. And then down in the corner of the property is a business. We do not want a CO2 pipeline on our property. There are many reasons. The setbacks need to be, in my opinion, 2 to 3 miles. If I was a Morningside resident and knew that that pipeline was going across that particular piece of property of ours, I would be up in arms objecting to it. Because it follows the valleys, it stays in the valleys. And as Summit Carbon Solutions has told us, oh, you can be within 50 feet of it because it just disseminates in a matter of just seconds. Well, it does not disseminate in that shorter time. The other thing is the particular type of steel that they're going to use to put the pipeline in, because of putting the gas through the liquid CO2 through the pipeline, there's water that collects in the bottom of that pipe. If that,
Ms. Tanning, that was 3 minutes, just to
Okay.
give you an idea how much time it takes to.
okay, well, there's one other thing I want to know. Liability insurance. Carbon Summit Solutions says we will fix the damage, okay? That is not liability. Somebody comes on our property and is injured because of the pipeline or next to the pipeline, liability it isn't covered by our insurance because it's a hazardous pipeline.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Do you have anyone else?
Deborah Main, 1026 Charles Avenue, Sioux City. Inventions have good intentions, but with cars, we have accidents. With the internet, we have scammers. With pipes, we have 2 hazardous CO2 pipelines proposed to come through our county. A gas compressed and transported at over 2,000 pounds of pressure in a supercritical liquid sets us up for an incident someday, somewhere. You know, God created CO2 for a reason. It feeds our plants and trees, who then give us the gift of oxygen. CO2 exists in 0.04% of the air we breathe. A CO2 pipeline rupture sends an explosive, freezing cloud into the air. A peer-reviewed article published in July of 2021 demonstrated the rupture of an 8-inch line. That's the size proposed to go within a half a mile of my house. The visible plume of pure cryo-frozen CO2 rose 197 feet into the air and settled to the ground, spreading out 1/4 mile. The solid CO2 now converts back to a gas. This concentrated, odorless, colorless cloud is carried by wind currents. It's toxic and asphyxiating, suffocating everything in its path. Well, how far and where to? Well, it depends on the temperature, wind currents, and topography. At 10% concentration, and remind you, this is a pure CO2 line, 99.9%. At only 10% concentration, the CO2 is lethal in 1 minute. The Pipeline Safety Administration will take 2 years to set new regulations for CO2 pipelines. That was a lesson learned from Satarsha, Mississippi. The lethal cloud there traveled miles to the city, and emergency responders did not have the equipment nor the training to rescue victims felled by the concentrated CO2 displacing oxygen in the air they breathed. Summit and Navigator want to push these through their projects before new rules, federal, state, and county, apply to them. So now the best possible ordinances need to be put in place for the best possible protections for we who live and work in Woodbury County. Members of this board are charged with the duty to write ordinances governing construction in our county. We will see the reality of hazardous CO2 pipelines in the light of day. Are we? Will we be prepared? So, and I have a handout if you'd like to have one.
We need to make a motion to accept
Hannah,
material.
I'll make a motion to accept the material.
We need a second.
Second.
this is a very well-written objection of one of our landowners that submitted it to the Utilities Board and has a lot of good information and references in it. I can't let you all know.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have this.
Yeah.
We have this in the.
Yeah, but that's all right.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name's Alan McGaffin, and I live on South Paxton Street in Sioux City. I want to thank Deborah Main, who just spoke. She called attention to this commission's meeting yesterday with a letter to the editor of the Sioux City Journal. And in the letter, Deborah mentions the Satarta, Mississippi gas rupture. My wife Terry and I attended the meeting that Summit sponsored early this year, I believe. It was over at the convention center. And the Mississippi rupture did come up several times in questioning that night to the Summit representatives. And at that meeting, I believe the reason they gave for why the rupture occurred was because of heavy rainfall. Mississippi is subject to probably a lot more heavy rainfall incidents than Iowa is, but we've seen our share. It's been a while, but we've seen our share of those. It disrupted the pipeline, and the pipeline had not recently enough been inspected, and that has been called to the attention of the PHMSA, which is the Petroleum Hazardous Waste group that studies accidents like this and how to prevent them. And studying that accident in Mississippi, they point out that a failure to conduct routine inspection of rights of way would have fostered a better understanding of the environmental conditions surrounding the facilities that could pose a threat to safe operations of the pipeline. I have heard so very little to nothing from Summit and the other pipeline companies regarding the safety and the inspection. They need personnel, and they're saying next to nothing about that. Now, we've all grown up with natural gas pipelines hither and yon all over the place. And the only time natural gas pipelines seem to break is when somebody with a backhoe runs into them and breaks them. But I know they also have a lot of man and woman power on the ground searching and inspecting. I'm not absolutely opposed to CO2. I think carbon sequestration is probably best done left in the ground with grasslands over the top of it. But if there's a better and a safer way, I would consider it, but I'm still not sold on it. But we've got to have people looking at these hazardous potentials before they occur. And we don't need to rush it. As Deborah pointed out yesterday, the Shelby County Commission really safeguarded it with their limits. I would urge the commission to look at Deborah's letter in yesterday's Sioux City Journal. She points out to me also that Shelby is one of the first counties in the state of Iowa to come up with these discussions. I don't know really quite why the board has pushed you quite so fast right now. Maybe it's to support the pipeline movement in general, but I'd urge you to take your time. We need to take our time. We shouldn't push this. Our lives are at stake. Thank you very much.
Other speakers?
Gail Palmquist, Lawton, Iowa. I am a landowner who Summit wants to send their pipeline across. I have several handouts that I want the board or the committee to read. Can I hand those in now?
We need a motion to receive documents.
A motion to receive.
Okay.
Good,
I'll second.
thank you.
Okay, I have one that's written by a State Farm insurance agent about their policy on these pipelines. They're not going to be responsible if we have liability claims from a pipeline bursting on our body, on our land. So it's going to be up to us to care for that liability. If that happens on my farm and damages my neighbor's Angus cow calf herd, damages any people around me, and we have a pretty dense neighborhood, I will lose the farm. That simple. So that's the first one, State Farm. I also have an article called "We've Done the Research and We Oppose Pipelines." This was written by several members of the University of Iowa. Well, actually, I think it was Iowa State faculty, and their points for not allowing these pipelines in Iowa. And I think if there are experts in the state, we should consider the advice of our university people. They study this and they should have the knowledge to sort through it. So the last one is a letter to the editor that I wrote this week to the Mobile Record. And I've got lots of comments about it, people asking for copies of it. So I thought I would just pass a copy out to you guys too, in case you haven't read it yet. So maybe some of you have already seen it. So I hope you take. So this is just not a discussion about a couple of hazardous pipelines tonight. It's about life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. All of these things are guaranteed to us through the Constitution of the United States, through the Declaration of Independence, and through the Constitution of Iowa. Remember that: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Our rights are guaranteed by our federal government and the state of Iowa. It's the job of each county's supervisors, their staff, and the planning and zoning boards to protect the safety of the residents and their rights to own land. Woodbury County needs to stand up to private corporations, which are trying to use our taxpayer money for private gain. It is not the county's job to cater to Summit and Navigator. So they are not part of us. They don't pay taxes here, even though they say they will. It's not going to amount to that much by the time we repair the roads and the bridges and get everything back to order again.
That was 3 minutes. Thank you very much. There's so much to say.
There certainly is. Yeah, I think we need another, there may be another 3-minute go around.
Thank you. Another 3 minutes? 3 more minutes.
All righty, thank you. Let's see here, where was I? Oh, I was talking about it's not the county's job to cater to Summit and Navigator. They definitely do not have our best interests at heart, as demonstrated by their actions time and time again. They have trespassed on our land, they have lied to us, they have tried to bully us and disrupt our lives. They have taken advantage of the elderly without family members present in nursing homes. They are threatening to use eminent domain if they don't get their way. They're threatening our families, our neighbors with hazardous pipelines, and they want us to agree to their terms. They will do some of the damage to some of the best cropland in the world, and it will not return to normal in the lifetime of any of us in this room. Do you know how long it takes to develop topsoil? It took nature thousands and thousands of years to give us this rich soil, and we should not be giving it up so gladly. For what would we give it up? 80% of the carbon dioxide sequestration projects have failed or have been discontinued. They have added more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere than they have removed due to the construction process and the operation of the projects, the facilities, and the pipelines. They will be a drain on our water supplies and our energy sources. We can't afford to lose more water in the droughts that we are in now. We need all the water we can to keep our crops growing. If they pull this off, this will be the biggest heist of taxpayer money ever, and a very dangerous one at that. Professors from our state universities, with their knowledge and investigative abilities, are very much against the pipeline for many reasons. Exeter County feels they need more legal help. They have the opportunities to sign up with the law firm of Cooney and Ehlers of Des Moines, who is representing other counties as well. And they are experts on county law. I don't think our Board of Supervisors has even discussed that option. We expect to see no less than the setbacks adopted for the wind turbines in Woodbury County recently. Woodbury County is a densely populated county, and a pipeline break would be disastrous to many people and animals. If a half-mile setback will keep out the wind turbines, we are entitled to the same or even greater setbacks to protect our lives from these pipelines. Another option would be to declare a 2-year moratorium. That would give PHMSA the time that they need to draw up their rules and regulations. As of now, we have no regulations from the state. We have no regulations from PHMSA on hazardous carbon dioxide pipelines. And the pipelines are very much hoping that they can get grandfathered in before PHMSA comes out with those rules. So I would urge that we do not let them build these pipelines until PHMSA has come out with their rulings and tell us how we can regulate them.
That was another 3 minutes.
All right, I'll give up. So,
Thank you.
So I'm Jana Martins. I live at 2678 110th Street in Mobile. I guess I had some questions that I kind of wanted your to expound a little bit on. So to my understanding, the hazardous material that's going to go through this requires a special, like a hazmat team. Is that correct? To respond to if something would happen?
That's a lot of information that we don't have. I personally don't have. All I know that there's an emergency response guidebook.
Okay.
I think, have we heard anything from our emergency team in Woodbury County about this? Does anybody know?
I think they respond to if it was a different type of pipeline leak too. It's not just specifically CO2.
Okay. And where are they located?
There was a
Omaha?
gentleman at our last meeting, Dan.
Well, it depends on the particular company. There's a protocol that comes down from the feds and the state that they would have to follow when they identify an emergency response and go through some channels kind of regulated through the feds.
So I hope this board would really take into consideration that we're volunteer firemen. With the fires that we've had in the fields, it really presses our resources as small communities. Something like this would be catastrophic. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. And that's been used in a few analogies here. So I hope that the board would consider before you make any ruling, and I do agree with what was said, that we do, as landowners, deserve the same setback that the wind farms have. And I think that there's a lot of research that needs to go into this on the zonings end of it before you actually just give a credit card and just say, okay, go for it. You know, no one wants hog confinements next to them. No one wants the wind farms next to them. I don't want this next to me. So I hope that you really put some effort and research what you're giving them when you say that they can have three. I think your setback was what, 330 feet? Not a lot. So anyway, I want to go on the record to say that I really am adamantly against this. So thank you.
Do you have any others?
Hi, my name is Karen Heath, and I live at 4809 Oxford Drive up in Singing Hills. I just want to support the gentleman that came up giving testimony about the pipelines and how much work they really do take, because I have Northern Pipeline coming right down in between the homes up there in between Birch and Oxford Drive. Northern is wonderful. We have not quite been there for 5 years yet. Probably 2 years ago, they took out a large section of pipeline and put in new. We see them out there many times, checking with like a Geiger counter type of thing. So they're testing for leaks. They also, I understand, have planes that go over and check. So that's a lot of work. It's a lot of money, huh? And listening to this, I have a hard time visualizing how anyone can come in on a property and take it over. And I'm thinking, well, what's their connotation of eminent domain? So I'd like to hear that from you. What does it mean, eminent domain?
Means that the state or federal government can take your property.
And summits of federal,
If it's for public use, it's for the higher public use.
no, I want you to read it to me. I don't want your
My interpretation,
interpretation, no.
do we have code in front of us about eminent domain? Okay. We don't have
Yeah,
that
I
in front
think
of us at
that's,
the
I
moment.
think that's very important to be looking at. Because I'm thinking that, well, okay, this pipeline thing must have precedence over eminent domain. I can't quite buy that, you know? I just, you know, your study doesn't seem to be in depth, I'll be honest with you. I really, really think that each and every one of you should be as interested as these people out here are, because the things I'm hearing from them seem to make more sense. And should it? You're on a panel. You know, our taxes pay for you. And I know it's probably not much, but you know, still you're here. You're supposed to care just as much as we do, right? So you have families just like we do. I just ask you, as good people, please hear us. This is very important. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name's Jim Collier. I live at 1650 Old Highway 141. Our farm is impacted by two of these pipelines, Summit and Navigator. The thing is they told me, because they've sent us easements to sign, is this isn't going to be a 4-inch line or 8-inch line. It could be a 12 to 24-inch line. So nobody's told me what would happen if a 24-inch line ruptures. How far does that spread? Are they talking about a 2-inch line? Because the offset from the pipeline is 920 feet from my back door. And I measured it today. And our neighbors is 1,294 feet. And two of my other neighbors are 600 and 800 feet. And then they have another pipeline that's going to be in front of their property. So I think we need to seriously think about the offset of these pipelines because they're not telling us what size they are. And the easement you sign is for the parcel. Well, they show it clear at the far side of it. But once you sign that easement, they can move it across that parcel to wherever it suits where they want to go. So it could get closer to my back door. And I think that's something that we should seriously consider is how far away are they really going to be? We don't know until they start digging. So they could be 300 feet. And when you're standing out the back of your house, 300 feet across the bean field isn't nothing. So I just want you guys to really consider. That's all I've got to say.
Hi, I'm Vicki Hulse from Mulville. And I guess I just have a few questions on how you gathered your information to get the 330 feet and then the 50 feet for industrial. And I don't see any recommendation for schools, hospitals, any kind of gathering where there would be children. And then the emergency response guidebook, was that, what emergency response guidebook? Where was that gathered from? Can you help me with some of these questions?
Yes. First off, an analysis has been prepared, basically looking at many of the concerns that have been mentioned about the safe distances, looking at plumes, looking at all the various aspects of the effects of CO2 on locations, and working with the emergency management department, the county engineer's office. We kind of looked really carefully at data. And the data is what the supervisors asked us to look for as something to root into for justification for a setback. Just pointing out a number or comparing one number to another number, we've seen that the studies, a lot of the European studies have been quite muddled in terms of what the different perspectives are. There are so many different concepts and variables to where CO2 can be dispersed that the one area that we could find data was under the emergency response guidebook, which was kind of pointed to us by the emergency management department as being the first initial safe zone during an incident were it to occur. Emergency responders would move the population to the 330 feet under the initial response. This particular guidebook is something that is a very common standard that is carried with the first responders across the board. It
In what
defines.
country?
It's in the United States, Canada, and Mexico as a common standard that goes along with
For
emergency
Hazardous
responders.
CO2?
CO2 is part of it. It's on there. There's various others such as ammonia, et cetera. It's a catch-all book that has numbers in it for safe distances. These books would be with your various first responders as being a common guide. That was the data that we could find as a concrete area, a concrete concept where if that setback was put into place, this is where the population generally in the cause of an event would
And
be
that was
brought
under
to.
2,200 pounds of pressure?
In terms of the response guide, yes, that's where the first responders would move the population to initially.
And only 50 feet for industrial? That was under that book also?
That number was not under the book. That concept came from the population as a residential center versus a commercial
I would
and
like
a
to look that up. How
and
can
a
I
general
find that?
industrial.
How can I find that?
The 50 feet was came up as not in terms of residential. It was put together in terms of the non-residential, kind of looking, we're balancing the concepts of the occupied structure where folks live there across the board 24 hours versus the proximity of commercial and industrial not having folks at the amount of time at that respective location. The other thing that we have had to look at very carefully through all of these proposals is the county's role as a local entity compared with the national government and the state government. The Natural Gas Act at the federal level and various others with which PHMSA regulates. There's standards in there that the companies, some of the companies would argue, including the natural gas, that the local government can be preempted. And what they mean by preemption is that they can basically tell the local government where the placement is of these respective pipelines. And so the case that was referenced in my opening remarks that's going on in Story County is a kind of a direct challenge to that. And what we're carefully trying to look at when I referenced consultation zones and planning zones, that's kind of a recommendation to create dialogue between property owners and pipeline companies and the county to create a conversation that there is a pipeline within those respectable areas. And because the federal government has, especially in the natural gas realm, controlled hazard mitigation, the safety, as well as the placement of these pipelines, in particular at the state and local level, much of the literature is pointed to communities using the consultation zones kind of in place of a setback. So what staff did was staff tried to put together a proposal that keeps in mind that communication is paramount in terms of the placement of these pipelines. Everybody that gets involved in a pipeline corridor should know about it, know what's in the area in terms of placement. So the planning zone would immediately create a conversation as far as development within that 1,000-foot area. But going back into the data, there's so many different variables as it comes to the calculation where you had mentioned, I know there's been proposals that we've read where it could be 500 feet, 1,000 feet, 2 miles. So there's different numbers out there. But what we found was that the emergency response guidebook is the location to move people to in the event of a scenario
I
there.
don't see anything for like hospitals or preschools or schools or anything. Did you have a setback for them? Or-
This This particular proposal looks at the setback for the occupied structure for the residential.
And that was 330 feet.
That's the 330 feet.
So, well, I just find it really hard to wrap my head around that you can do a setback of 2,500 feet for the wind turbines, and you can recommend 50 to 330 feet for a hazardous pipeline under 2,220 pounds of pressure. It just, it doesn't even make sense to me. I hope you reconsider that. That's my comments. Thank you.
My name's Steve Maxwell, 248 South Pearl, Mobile, Iowa. This pipeline will impact a lot of my parents' land. I guess my question is that you ask all this data and all, but these scenarios have not really been done as far as the hazardous CO2 pipeline. The one is Mississippi did rupture it all. And so I think the board needs to consider that Shelby and Story County both did 1,000 feet for residences and a half a mile for cities, schools, anything like that. And like I say, you can have all the data you want, but there's not that much data out there as far as what a rupture of a pipeline is concerned. So I think the board needs to keep this in mind. And I know that your job is to kind of get the idea of how far to do something like a planning and zoning or anything like that. But that's just something that I wanted to throw the comment out, because I'm questioning the data at all when there's probably not that much data out there that something like this has ever happened at all. So thank you.
Anyone else?
I'm Doyle Turner, 2738 200 Street, Mobile. I'd like to ask a question of how many pipelines are they limited within this easement area? I think that's something you should probably figure out. The state of Iowa has about 56,000 square miles within it. We currently have 46,000 feet of pipeline within the state. That means that we're nearly at 85% of the square miles in Iowa have pipelines. Now, we have a pipeline on our farm. We actually have two of them. The easement is 60 feet for that pipeline, and the two pipes are 10 feet apart. They were not put in at the same time. I don't believe they were even put in by the same company at the time. They are owned by the same company today. They have enough room to easily put another pipeline in there. Now, if you look at this from a statistical standpoint, like one gentleman pointed out, typically it's a backhoe. We had a tile plow, we had a pipeline. We've had discs hit a pipeline down on the bottom, down by Holly Springs. They vary a lot in their final depth. But anyhow, if you look at this statistically, if you put a pipeline down the east half of your quarter section, you have a certain amount of risk of something happening to that pipeline. If you put another pipeline down the middle of that quarter section, you're essentially going to double that risk. Would you agree? So what I'm trying to say is, if we're taking this CO2 from all of these ethanol plants, well, we know that all these ethanol plants already have pipelines to them, correct? With the exception of the Cargill ethanol plant in Blair, every one of these ethanol plants are fired by natural gas. So there is already an easement to every one of these ethanol plants. There is an easement that is wide enough to put these pipes anywhere they want to put them within the existing easements. So why are we coming up with more easements? Your job as a zoning board is to protect the public within a reasonable bounds. I think it is perfectly reasonable for you to require these companies to at least show you that they did their due diligence to try and put these pipelines in existing easements without just coming out here and creating new easements. You know, there's no reason that just because these companies can't play in the same sandbox, that the public needs to take extra risk. I also think that in the past, you will find that farmers have access to natural gas. If somebody was smart enough when they put that pipeline in, they were offered access to the pipeline. They had to forego the money. Now, we all know that this is going to end up in an eminent domain battle, and eminent domain should be for the public. Well, if they only have one customer and it's somebody owns the pipeline who isn't part of the public, and that customer is out of state and isn't part of the public, this is not a public good. So I think what we need to do is possibly define what we mean by a public good. Because this should not be a project that has eminent domain, because it's only serving one customer. And I think that the county does have the legal authority to tell these people that if you're going to go across their land, you have to give them access to that CO2. CO2 is an extremely valuable commodity. This is not something that they're going to sequester in the ground forever. Our Air Force is currently making synthetic jet fuel out of CO2. There's a company in Canada that is doing the same. We do not want to export this CO2. There is no reason that everybody on this pipeline can't buy CO2 and produce their own fuel. I think it's time that we educate ourselves on what's really going on here, and that we stand up. And, you know, Iowa has a bad history of exporting all of our natural resources. Let's actually use this one. Let's add value to it. Thank you.
Anyone else?
I have one more thing to say about it. Since they say it's so good, the pipeline, and we're going to do all this for the ecology and all of this, out of the whole world, this whole thing is less than 2% of the CO2 produced. So where's this big impact that these pipelines are telling us that this is going to make? We're going to take all these cars off the road. They use California all the time. California wants to go electric. So what are we after? The tax credits are to help us. That's all I have to say.
Hi there, Dan Bittinger, 2901 Sunset Circle, Sioux City, 51104. John Marshall Harlan, he was the U.S. Supreme Court Justice 1880 through 1910. He was known as the Great Dissenter. He said, "The law follows society, not society follows the law." Let me say that again. The law follows society, not society follows the law. The law here I would define as the law follows the money goes to societal companies and government officials. Now, this is not aimed at you, of course, you're just planning and zoning. But I would suggest a few things. Once again, subsidies. Where is this carbon pipeline going to benefit? The end goal was subsidies. The USA produces 9% of all carbon emissions of the world. The other, in essence, over 90% is from China and India. So how does this benefit America? When the EPA already regulates and says that we have cleaned up and we have greater control of carbon emissions since the 1940s, that we've increased by threefold of cleaning our environment. So how does this pipeline help? Once again, I would say it's subsidies. It's taxpayers' money being given to private entities, private organizations. And I would say I'd encourage you to look at that. Look at the subsidies. Follow the money. Secondly, California, as we just stated, California, New York are pressing to go all electric. It's been said from these carbon companies that if we don't capture the carbon, that California and other states will not buy our ethanol. Why will we be beholden to other states? If they don't want it, well, good. We'll sell it to somebody else and make Iowa rich. Forget these other states. And then lastly, the rise of federalism. Locally, we must take back the right. The Constitution says that we have the right to govern ourselves locally. All items that are not endowed to the federal government revert back to the state and the local county governments. And so once again, federalism it's the rise of subsidies. The subsidy governments, subsidy laws, people are benefiting off the hard work taxpayers here in Woodbury County. And yes, I'm for capitalism, for earning money, but at the end of the day, this is a private company, not for the public good. They will earn a lot of money off hardworking Iowans, and the Iowans will not benefit from this. And so I just encourage you, look at some of those things and remember that the law follows society. We saw in the windmill that the farmers, the rural residents came out and spoke, and the laws followed that. And so I just encourage you to listen to the people and don't be beholden to catchy websites, slogans, the selling that somehow this will save our environment. Our environment is already in a good place, and we must take care of our farmers and rural residents and make sure their property is protected. Thank you.
Jody Wilson. I live north of Sioux Falls, so I drove down today on behalf of my mom, 1449 Charles Avenue. I just want to kind of comment. She's all ready to go. So, just on some of the other things that everybody else has talked about. You know, the emergency response. My son-in-law is a firefighter back home. And as soon as I told him about this, he's like, oh no, don't do it. They don't have the equipment. They don't have the training. They don't have the funding. Sure, Summit and Navigator say that they're going to provide that. But what about after the initial investment? What are they going to do for the upkeep of the equipment? What are they going to do for the training? I don't know. You guys mentioned that you read about Satarsha. Have you seen the video of Satarsha that we had with Just Mazur? They had some guests on. It was emergency responder. It was one of the victims who was found unconscious in their car within a half mile of the house. Very moving. Very moving. If you haven't seen it, let us know. We could forward you that video. So I think and the other gentleman talked about how far distance is to his back door, to his several neighbors. That's the same situation where my mom's at, and it's actually closer to her back door and everything. So I really worry about that plume, how it's supposed to go 1,500 feet within 4 minutes. There's several farmers and houses within 1,500 feet of where that pipeline is going to be. I think it's only within 100 yards, 100 feet, I should say, or less to my mom's door where she lives. You talked about how we should start a conversation with the landowners, Dean, and with Summit and Navigator and everything. It's hard to have a conversation with them because you go to these informational meetings, they put on a good show, but there's a lot of holes. There's a lot of misfacts. When I went to the one here in Sioux City, but then I also attended the one up in Sioux Falls just to see what they were saying, because that was later. One of the graphics they have on there is the stages that they have. And they have where they're going to put the topsoil on one side of the hole, And they're going to put the rest of it on the other side to keep that topsoil separate. That is not what the graphic showed. They were called out about it. Jimmy from Summit was asked about it. His response in Sioux Falls was, that's the picture they gave us, so that's what we had to use. They find the best ways to provide the best numbers for the public to make sure that everybody thinks that they're going well, but they're not doing that. So do you have 2 words for it? Do you have? Oh, okay. She wanted to say think safety because it's coming down to her area. It's going down through the generations, the farmland. We want to keep it. Thank you.
Yep, come to the microphone, please.
Gail Palmquist again. I'd like to know how many people in this room are in favor of having carbon dioxide pipelines go through our farmlands? Nobody? Nobody wants them, right? So why is the county not representing us? We're the ones that are gonna have to live with this. It's gonna be our lives, our farms, our kids, the next generations that have to live with this, and it's gonna be forever. They want these pipelines to go through perpetuity. That's not 5 years, 10 years, it's forever. And you're gonna destroy this precious land that we have. How many of you want to live next to a pipeline 330 feet away from your house? Raise your hand. Anybody? No, you don't want it either. So why are you supporting these setbacks? It's ridiculous. 330 feet, that doesn't give you time to get out of bed. If it happens in the night, you're not going to even know what happened. You're going to be dead in the morning. Everybody in your household's going to be dead. There's no warning. We don't know when it's coming. So you better think long and hard before you give a recommendation to the supervisors about this, because it's going to be on your backs if we ever have an accident here. And I don't mean to be nasty or anything, but that's the truth. Thank you.
Todd Gross. Quick question here, 1661 180th Street, Sioux City, Iowa. Minor subdivisions that aren't developed yet, are they in that 330 feet? There's no house there yet, but a future plan to build a house? Just, where's that stated on that?
It would be on existing structures. There's nothing there at this point. There's not a setback off the structure.
Okay, can you take that in consideration that it was subdivided? We all know the times we're in right now. It's not the easiest to build these days, so. Take that in consideration on the subdivisions too that are not developed yet.
Doyle Turner, 2738 200 Street. A lot of comments have been made about the wind turbine setback. And I think you even referenced it just a little bit, but correct me if I'm wrong. I believe the windmill turbine setback was set at the maximum incident of what a turbine had thrown something. Is that correct?
Yeah, and just to clarify, that debate was rooted in data.
Yep.
in terms of what you had mentioned there. And the wind debate is completely a different debate than what
Yes,
this
yes.
is. And the pipeline, again, you can get into the arguments. If you go back to post-World War II, when much of the pipelines, especially the natural gas, were put into place, they're intrastate, national security based. And so that's where the federal government has played a role in terms of preempting, and the way that the federal statutes, as well as the Iowa 479, I think, they read to put the authority in the Iowa Utilities Board in terms of the siting and the location of those things. And that's where it puts the local government in a little bit of a situation on where can we assert zoning, basically. That's what this is asserting zoning. And I would just like to lay the fact that we came up with our report that the county's current general plan was established in 2005. And if you've looked at Iowa Code 479B, they put a lot of emphasis in what the general plan is, what the planning measures are for the community as a whole. And when the 2008 zoning ordinance was put into place for Woodbury County, they established a table of land uses. And the table of land uses are really the guide. We open up the ordinance, somebody calls in, can I do this with my land? Can I do that with my land? And typically we'll have a category, you go to the category, you'll have an allowed use. You can operate that way on your land. We have other areas that require a conditional use permit. And so it was determined back in 2008 that the conditional use permit would be put in next to pipelines. And so on the basis of that level of zoning, any pipeline company that approaches Woodbury County right now at this point, if we get an application in 5 minutes from now, that application is going to be submitted to this board, and they're going to review it. They're going to look at 6 criteria and a couple of what they call considerations, and much of those considerations reflect on what is the conditions on the ground with the neighborhood. So there's some evaluation on how something like that fits, that particular use with the community as a whole. So this board here is a recommending body. They make a recommendation over either to the supervisors or to the Board of Adjustment. And so the Board of Adjustment receives the information that is gleaned from the public. Everything that's being said here tonight is part of the record. It helps all these folks make decisions based on what fits, what does not fit, et cetera. And so that information is gleaned and offered to the Board of the Board of Supervisors in the case of an ordinance change. But going back to the conditional use permit, if a pipeline application is brought forward, this board would look at it, and the Board of Adjustment would hold the public hearing, and there would still be the issuance of a pipeline permit at the Board of Adjustment level. So the question remains now, the Board of Adjustment has the authority to put conditions in. Some folks would argue that a Board of Adjustment resolution or a condition is the similar force of an ordinance. By virtue of approving this this conditional use permit, you must follow these conditions that were prepared out of the testimony, out of all the information that was considered. And then the respective applicant who gets the permit must live up to that, or they're in a sense violating the zoning ordinance and the county regulations there. So looking at it as a whole, regardless of whether there's setbacks or there's not setbacks, this is a regulatory function that goes through the county. So what we're carefully watching, and we've been watching all along, is what's happening in the Shelby and Story and all these other communities. And looking at going through the staff report, for example, we cited similar concepts that were mentioned here tonight on what our authorities are. Our authority under Iowa Code is to have zoning. We have different aspects of what we can regulate with that zoning. The question that we're all kind of looking at is any policy that is put into place, can it meet muster? In other words, if it goes to the court, will a setback stick? And so where we get the 330 is because the 330 is probably a setback. I understand the opinions on it, absolutely. But the 330 gives us a piece of data that has been approved and vetted in terms of mitigation, hazard mitigation response. And that's the one number that we can find that we can hang our hat on and say, here's a reasonable number that we found from the data that can be implemented within a setback. Now, if you go up to 1,000, 1,200, you get into a scenario where situations are arbitrary. When you look at the plume, we all know how variables work. We know wind speed, we know topography, we know elevation, we know 5 trees, we know bushes, all of those little things scientifically affect something. And when you put a respective number into place, the number has to be valid and make sense to be, in a sense, fair across the board for everyone. And so the 330 was devised correctly in the emergency response.
The old saying is fair is what we decide is fair.
Yeah.
But the comment that I was making was the setback for the windmills was based off the maximum amount that size turbine could throw. Mm-hmm. That we had evidence that proved they've thrown things that far. And I guess topography and all of that comes into play with turbines also. And I think if you're going to follow the same line of thought, you would have to say, what is the longest distance that a plume has gone? And if you went in that direction, you would be in the same line of thought as what the wind turbine decision was.
Yeah, and to point out too, because it's a reasonable thing to look at. Typically, when you bring a proposal together, you want a sound proposal.
Right.
A sound proposal that's going to make statistical sense, has statistical backing where it can be justified if it's ever challenged. And so from the aspect of being challenged, an emergency response guidebook, by not having a setback to going up to 330, the reasonable meter is on the 330 kind of at this point. There are different plume scenarios, as you mentioned. Plumes can definitely go out different ways, but kind of the general standard is the 330 from an occupied residential area is a concept to possibly say, here is a line, here's a safety measure, a mechanism where if you're 330 foot back and you're sitting in your living room, you're already in the initial response location where the first responders would expect you to be after the notification procedure.
But that also encompasses all different kinds of pipelines, anhydrous, ammonia, natural gas.
Well,
that's all pipelines, not just CO2.
And what the public should really carefully look at too is the natural gas. If we get into the preemption, there's different designations there up in PHMSA, and the hazardous liquid pipelines. That it's left with the question there on what the local governments can do, and that's what Story County and they're looking at right now with this case being in the federal court. The question is, does the county, the local level, whether it be the unincorporated or the city, do they have authority to challenge or create their own setback versus what Iowa Utilities Board implements or what the federal? So that's really the question that would be debated.
And I guess I think most everybody here would be willing to spend tax dollars to make that fight. And I guess I understand where you're coming from. You're coming up with something that you believe can go into a courtroom and be passed and be standing when it was done. I think the amount of time that you're looking at from 330 feet, dead's dead. Whether let's face it, they talked about that woman that died in her car. The CO2 sucks the oxygen out of the air. So the car stopped running. That's why she died. So just because you can get in the car doesn't mean you're going to get away from this. 330 feet with a CO2 pipeline, for most pipeline probably is that first place. Those people that make it to the 330 feet aren't going to make it, more than likely, statistically speaking. If you're stopping at that point, that's the last stop you're going to make. You know, so I think from a legal standpoint, it's time for us to say that our federal guidelines are woefully behind the times. I mean, let's face it, didn't you say that was written in 2008?
You're talking about the county's ordinance?
No,
That's-
the federal, the response book.
Well, that's frequently updated. It's kind of a yearly catalog. They have the various designations of chemicals, and, you know, pipeline
I used to
contents
be
across
safety
the board.
director at Transit. I have a lot, I mean, but government agencies don't usually go after something until they're pushed. So CO2 pipelines in this type of atmosphere are new. And I think we should be the push. And if we got to pay some tax dollars to do that, I think we're willing to spend it there. So thank you. And I appreciate you letting me talk again.
This is Jana Martins again. You keep talking about the data. Where do I go to look that up? Like I'm assuming that that's what you're basing everything on. Is it, where do I go to look that up that you're reading?
The emergency response guidebook is widely available online. I can definitely, if you want to
Yeah, I
talk to
would.
me
And does
about
it,
that.
does it address the CO2? You
It-
said it's all hazardous material, but that's totally different.
CO2 is one of the items that is on the list. They have various, like the title says, it's a guidebook on
It's a
how
guidebook.
emergency responders
Exactly.
would deal with the hazard mitigation situation as a rapid
I
response.
see.
And
Okay.
yeah.
So yes, I'd like information to look that up. And I guess what concerns me is that your vehicles don't run. So where does that leave you? Anyway, but yeah, where would I get that? Or you're going to put it, the website?
Well, technically, if you do a typical online search with that term, it should pop up to the top of the results. But if folks would want to share
And it's
their
a
emails
federal-
with me
It's a
afterward,
federal
Yeah.
handout.
it's widely available online.
Okay.
So
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
it's you would want to do a search for emergency response guidebook.
I believe I heard you say that it's an assumption that the 330 feet would be safe. I understand that it's written, but it's based off of an assumption. I'm sure I heard you say that it was an assumption. What's wrong with facts? There are studies that have been done by scientists. They exploded the crazy thing. And the pipeline became like a zipper and it just blew. This is fact. This is the fact that that plume moved miles. Fact.
Kurt Gregg, 1261 Delaware, Lawton, Iowa. I just want to thank the board for tackling this. It's a pretty thankless job, I'm sure of that. And there's a lot of emotion here, which I understand. I'm in the middle of it all too. But I think what we really need to be looking at is why our federal government is willing to put so much money out at a totally untested theory about people who don't really have an agenda other than their agenda. And I think we all need to look at that side of this rather than getting into arguments with one another. I mean, you're doing the best you can. I've been on boards, you got to deal with what you got to deal with, but I understand, but that's it. Thanks.
Anyone else? Do we have any comments from the commissioners that we'd like to share at this point? Otherwise, we can go into closed session.
I'll make a motion to close session.
Okay, we got a motion?
I'll second.
Okay, we've got a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
You're now in closed session. Comments? Thoughts?
I guess, to start off, couple points I'd like to address. Karen, regarding eminent domain, the Iowa Utility Board is who's going to determine whether that's going to be used or not, can be used or not. This board has nothing to do with that. I'm not in favor of the use of it, personally, not as a board. And I do have 3 pipelines running across my property. I wish none of them were there. We work fairly well together, but I still wish they weren't there. The other comment I would like to make is these setbacks that are being discussed will apply to hazardous material pipelines. That's the CO2, natural gas, liquid petroleum. All those setbacks, or all those pipelines will have that same setback. It also works as a reverse setback, so that homes, if you own a home within that setback distance, you can't rebuild it if it's damaged to 50%. You can't expand it. So there's, if you put a setback of a mile and you encompass every home in the area, none of those homes can be rebuilt. None of those homes can be expanded on. None of those bare lots can even be built on. Those are the questions and the problems that arise when you come up with a large setback. And like I said, if you look at the pipeline map on the east edge of Sioux City, there's a lot of pipelines already there. And there's a lot of area in that quadrant that would not be buildable or would not have homes be rebuilt if they're damaged. So that's the hard part I have of putting out a large setback that's going to apply to you as a landowner. Right now, you can't rebuild your house if something happens to it. How does that hurt you? I guess that's the question I have is, are you willing to give up the right to rebuild your house or expand it to have those setbacks? Because they will apply to all hazardous pipelines.
I think I just want to emphasize too, that we appreciate you being here and the comments that you've made, because like Dan said, they are part of the record. So we know how the people feel. And again, there's things that are obviously out of our control, but we're trying to do the best to present to our supervisors to make good decisions too, so that we can protect the public and we can protect your property. We live here too. I have 2 pipelines going through 2 of my properties, so I understand the danger of it, but we also have a process in place right now, and we always have. We have since 2003. Well, before that, 1978, when zoning was initiated. The nicest thing that I think that we have about this current conditional use permit is that it gives us a lot more flexibility to deal with each and every application that comes to us. So we still get public participation even in those situations. We deal with the property owners. You know, we ask for concessions. We look at the environmental situations. We go through as many details as we can. And it's through the Board of Adjustment, which is quasi judicial. And we watch those applications to see how it impacts our communities. So we do take a lot of these things into consideration, but I appreciate you being here tonight. Anybody else? Do we have an action that we want to take tonight?
I guess first off, I wouldn't be comfortable moving forward on anything regarding the ordinance. There's too much at stake for everyone in the room and for people who aren't in the room and aren't aware of what's going to happen to them one way or the other. I do like the fact that the current process with the conditional use permit actually can be more limiting than an ordinance. If you write it, the ordinance, those are the rules they got to go by. If it's a conditional use permit, they have to listen to each and every one of you when you come in to talk to them and say, I don't want this, or I want this because of this reason. So by establishing a ordinance, you've set the rules and that's what they got to follow. If they meet them, they're good to go. Conditional use, it comes down to each and every situation, and some situations will be told no. So I guess I would make the comment that I'm in favor of utilizing the conditional use permit, and the guidelines can be for a CO2 pipeline different than they can be for a natural gas pipeline. It's each permit that comes before the board will be treated differently, and that gives that body the ability to place regulations upon that specific pipeline, that specific company, and they have to follow them. And from what everyone said tonight and the information I read, CO2 pipelines probably have to meet a different guideline than a natural gas pipeline or than a liquid petroleum. We've had liquid petroleum lines in the eastern edge of Sioux City since the 40s and 50s. I don't know of a single death that's been caused by them. I'm not saying that it can happen, but I have one 92 feet from my house, and I don't have any concern that that pipeline is going to cause me risk. Thank you for coming too. Sure.
Come on up. Will you come up so everyone can
If
hear
you come
you?
up to the mic, then everyone can hear what you're saying. Thank you.
Hypothetically, there's a blow, it damages my home. I cannot come to you and get a conditional use permit to have it rebuilt. Is that what you're telling me?
Would that be through a variance or would it even be allowed?
You're talking about the rebuild?
We're talking about what it's not a conditional use permit that's going to happen with your house. If you come up with a setback that applies in an ordinance to pipelines, and the setback is, say it's 500 feet. It also works as a reverse setback, meaning that a pipeline can't be built within 500 feet of your home. But if there's an existing pipeline running within 80 feet of your home, anything that changes with your house, your home now becomes a non-conforming structure, is what it would, if it's within that 500 feet. So that would then mean that that can't be expanded and it can't be rebuilt. And that's due to the reverse setback. Once you increase that setback, right now, I'm assuming I don't know if you know how far you are from the pipeline, but there really is no setback in Woodbury County ordinances that say how far that pipeline needs to be from your house or your house needs to be from the pipeline. So you're a legal structure right now. If we impose an ordinance that creates a 330 foot or a 500 foot setback, if you fall within that 500 foot setback, you now become a non-conforming structure, your house. You can stay there, nothing's going to change currently, but if you want to expand or do anything different, it takes away, it's a regulatory taking that takes away some of your rights that you currently have. So that's where putting an ordinance in effect that's covering all pipelines, anybody that has a pipeline within 330 or whatever you're asking for a setback, if that becomes the new setback, you now have a non-conforming structure. So that's my point, that I'm really hard pressed to say, let's put 1,000-foot setback
No,
and
but
apply
I'm-
to all
I'm glad you brought
pipelines.
that up, but I had a
You need to
question.
think of it from both
Yeah,
ends, and that's
yeah.
where a conditional use
And
permit.
that's what you guys have to do. I
Well, that's
understand
where the conditional use permit right now works better, I think, because you're not going to impose undue burden on existing pipeline individual or people that live next to individual pipelines currently. You're just going to treat the CO2 pipeline that's being built this way, and here's our conditions, and this is
I
what you
think
have
that
to meet.
The people, the issue is the way it's being handled. It's not that as much that it is a pipeline, okay? It's the way that it's being handled by the company.
And that's one thing, I guess, I don't know if people are misinformed. This board has not done anything to promote CO2 pipelines. We have not talked to any companies. Nothing's ever been presented to us about putting this pipeline in other than what comes from the public. Nothing from the companies. So we're not promoting it. We're just basically trying to come up with a set of rules that work to play by, and maybe that set of rules isn't what needs to be done. Maybe it's a conditional use permit that we can look at each one individually, because pipelines don't show up very often in Woodbury County. I don't know when the last one was built, but back in the 80s, I think, a new pipeline that came through. So it's not that hard to deal with it on a conditional use basis where you can treat each one individually.
Just a quick question. Dan, did Shelby and Story, did they do ordinances or did they do a conditional use permit?
The understanding of Shelby is it supplements the conditional use permit. And so what our conditional use permit does is it is the criteria. We're going through both boards and everything. So, and any additional changes to the ordinance would add on to the conditional use process. So it would basically give the zoning commission and the Board of Adjustment more language to consider that permit. See, the zoning commission, Board of Adjustment ultimately decide the pipeline permit regardless.
Okay.
It has to go through the public and through the process that the chair and Tom have both described. But Shelby, my understanding with Shelby specifically is it's part of their conditional use.
I like what you're thinking, Tom, and this type of pipeline seems to be a little bit different, would have different criteria than the other pipelines that we've dealt with before.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess since it's new, we're still learning. So, you might learn more in another year and things have to change. That's where I feel the conditional use permit would fit better with this type of situation.
Feds are giving them for their tax credits.
That's one thing too is,
Two, now there's three, and then there's four of them in the state of Iowa. And we're right in an area where what's gonna stop once we start letting it happen?
and that's, oh, okay.
Conditions on it, so you don't lump everything together.
And that's the thing, right now, we can currently have a application, a permit come before us. We can recommend to not accept it. The Board of Adjustment can deny it. The next step is the courts, where whoever it would be would have to then contest that decision. So we have in place a way to either approve or deny a permit on a pipeline currently. The ordinance really doesn't say yes or no, we're accepting it. It just creates a set of rules. We haven't done anything on it. There's not been anything come before us for a permit. There's no action that's ever been brought before this board to receive a permit for a pipeline. The pipeline's coming at it from. That's with the Iowa Utility Board, where their argument is, do they have the right to even come on your land and survey it? That is a decision that's created by the Iowa Utility Board. That's where you really need to be contacting and talking to the Iowa Utilities Board. But that's what I'm saying. They're going to decide. they're going to decide whether eminent domain can even be used. That hasn't even been decided yet. So, right, but what I'm getting at is until that ruling. But right now they don't have the authority to use eminent domain. Well, no, they don't have the authority granted to them by the Iowa Utilities Board. And that's where I mean, the argument should be made that they're not a public benefit in use.
Sewer, even if the county wanted to say, hey, we need a gravel road across your land, I'm all for that, because you know what? It benefits everybody. You know what I mean?
Right, right. And like I said, I hope you understand, it hasn't even came to us as a permit.
But we're glad to be here to voice our concerns before you're confronted.
So I'm gonna say, if a permit does come, please turn it down. It's gonna set a precedence. Is that not right? If it's approved within the county?
Kind of to address generally, just to kind of go through the process, as Tom had said, no application has been received. And so when an application does become received under the current process, the conditional use process is designed to notify the affected property owners, typically within 500 feet of any affected property under the way the ordinance is written for the conditional use process. And so it gets put into the papers. The zoning commission has a review session. What the zoning commission does is they have to look for a complete application. And the complete application is that they provide a certified abstractor listing, which is from an abstracting company that defines who all the neighbors are by looking at the legal descriptions of the property so that everybody is in real time identified. And then they will get notices of when the public hearing will be held. And this is defined as a kind of a two-step process. The zoning commission has to look at criteria by virtue of the ordinance. Our ordinance has specific language in it that the pipeline companies, or the applicants, I should say, must meet. They must meet the criteria in there to meet a certain standard so that the zoning commission can make a recommendation one way or the other. So when Tom talks about the characteristics of the property, when you take out a conditional use permit, I know we're all quite used to conditional use permits that involve one property where there's one applicant asking for a particular use on how to operate the property. Those are usually pretty reasonable, straightforward in terms of dissecting what works, what does not work with the area. But under the conditions of what it's looking like, if we were to receive an application, there's going to be a long corridor of properties that are inside of that conditional use permit. So the zoning commission is going to have to specifically look at that pipeline corridor, everything about that property, where the pipeline is, the surrounding areas, what is the general effect on the neighborhood, various environmental based conditions. I'm going to just show you, if we zoom down, I do have the conditional use criteria here somewhere. Okay, right in front of you, this isn't the best way to deliver this, but This is the 6 criteria of the conditional use permit. So if somebody brings in an application, the board is going to have to look at how this fits with the county's zoning ordinance. So one of the first criteria is the conditional use requested is authorized as a conditional use in the zoning district within which the property is located, and that any specific conditions or standards described as part of the authorization have been or will be satisfied. So the first thing we do with that is we look into the zoning ordinance's table of land use. We look at to see if pipelines is actually a conditional use in the zoning district in which the property owner's property resides. With our current zoning ordinance, a conditional use is in every single zoning district. So that criteria means that an application can come to the zoning commission for consideration. The next thing they would look at for criteria number 2 is the proposed use and development will be in the harmony with the general purpose and intent of this ordinance and the goals, objectives, and standards of the general plan. So that's the development plan, the general plan of Woodbury County. So the board has to look at various aspects from the zoning ordinance to see that it fits, as well as part of the future planning of the county. The next one is the proposed use and development will not have a substantial or undue adverse effect upon adjacent property, the character of the neighborhood, traffic conditions, parking, utility facilities, and other factors affecting public health, safety, and general welfare. So within that statement there, Zoning Commission, Board of Adjustment can look at various concerns. The next one, the proposed use and development will be located, designed, constructed, and operated in such a manner that it will be compatible with the immediate neighborhood and will not interfere with orderly use, development, and improvement of the surrounding property. So again, another area to look at. Then they go on with essential public facilities and services will adequately serve the proposed use or development. The other one is the proposed use or development will not result in unnecessary adverse effects upon significant natural, scenic, or historic features of the subject property or adjacent properties. Then we move down in the zoning ordinance also, and this is actually cited in textual format. This isn't the actual zoning ordinance up on the screen, but the other considerations are the proposed use or development at the particular location is necessary or desirable to provide a service or facility that is in the public interest or will contribute to the general welfare of the neighborhood or community. Then the last consideration is all possible efforts, including building and design, site design, landscaping, and screening have been undertaken to minimize any adverse effects of the proposed use or development. So why do I read this off? Because this is the existing authority that the Zoning Commission and the Board of Adjustment have to see that these criteria can be met in terms of county zoning. And now with that said, sometimes on the surface, maybe something may not be able to be met. And so the Zoning Commission, Board of Adjustment in particular, has the authority to put conditions onto these criteria to ensure that it can be met. So in other words, if an applicant is able to meet this, affecting this, so kind of the cause effect scenario, they can put a condition into a resolution. And so what happens is the Board of Adjustment authors a resolution, which is a formal document, kind of similar to an ordinance in some respects, but it's a formal document that holds the applicant to the standards as authorized to them by the zoning ordinance. So yes, this is that kind of customized approach that fits with various uses across Woodbury County, across the board. And that's one of the reasons we have a zoning commission and a board of adjustment, as well as criteria in the ordinance, because things are not always top down. There's customization, there's scenarios involved that things have to be looked at at a closer level. And that's really what a conditional use permit is. It involves the public, it involves the applicant, and of course the boards to have a formal conversation on whether something is acceptable for a particular location or is not. And that's what we currently have in place. Well, kind of going into the terminology of conditional use right now, if an applicant were to present the application for the conditional use, they'd have to tell us things about what it is. And so by generally having the words pipeline in there, it allows us to have a greater understanding of what the proposal is. So the zoning commission, board of adjustment, as well as staff would have to look at every case on a case-by-case basis based on what the proposal is, so that they have relevant information at hand to make the decision as a whole. So with the customization, hazardous liquid pipelines do have various aspects. There's numerous of them. They're diverse in nature. The contents of each and every pipeline have different effects on the public as a whole. And so kind of going back and trying to look at least at the intent of the 2008 ordinance, it does appear to me that the intent was to understand that there's a lot of different unique aspects, whether it's pipelines or other uses across the county, to when an application comes in to really require the zoning commission staff and the boards to understand the nature of that application and do our research so that we can apply the appropriate concepts that fit with those criteria that are up there on the board. So the last revision to our process, of course, was the 2008 in particular.
Gail, I guess I'd like to address that. That's where I feel the conditional use permit comes into play, that we do have to listen to current information. It's not an ordinance. It's not something that was written. It's what we have to do at the time the permit comes before us. And that's where information is presented. If something has changed in the last year, it doesn't really matter. We're going to get the latest data to base our decision on, versus if there's an ordinance written, those rules are in place, they could be outdated. You know, a year from now, an ordinance that we may adopt today might not really apply, but the conditional use gives you the flexibility to look at all the information put before you and then make a decision. And that's fluid. That changes all the time. It's just a process that we go through, but the information that comes forward is new information and up-to-date information. So the conditional use permit isn't something that's written. It's just a process that we go through. So it does give us that ability to be up to date and not based on rules that were written 10 years ago. Right, and that was the comment that I made earlier, that this ordinance, if it were to be adopted, because it isn't, pertains to all pipelines, and that's the fault I find, is that you shouldn't treat a natural gas pipeline the same as you treat a liquid petroleum or you treat a CO2. There's a difference. So I don't know where you lump them together in an ordinance and treat them all the same. That's where the conditional use permit, like I said, I think has the ability to do that, to separate CO2 from a natural gas pipeline, because there's nothing to say a natural gas pipeline permit wouldn't come before us in the next 6 months. And we could treat it with a conditional use permit, but it could be looked at differently than a CO2 pipeline just because it's different.
I was going to give a quick example just to explain conditional use permit through the Board of Adjustments. I was a chairman on the Board of Adjustments. Joanne Sadler was on the board with me. And I think you might have been at the meeting. It was for the pumpkin patch on Highway 20, the scarecrow. And that had to go through a conditional use permit. And you'd think, why does a business have to go through that? It was standing room only at that meeting with all the people that were against it, all the people that lived behind it. And we put specific hours that could be open and specific days that could be open and where they could park cars. And they had to abide by that. It was binding. That was the power of the Board of Adjustments, which is a separate board than this board. So you don't have specifics like Gail's asking for, but it's a process. And you have to understand the power behind. Right, exactly right. And it gives it power. And maybe not everyone realizes how that works.
I think the emphasis too is that it's current information. It's not something that we looked at 5 years ago or last year, because we know this is moving quickly. And the more current our information is, the better. And we have the opportunity to review it. And generally speaking, we talked about some of our historical, I just lost my thought, historical applications. And we usually go through them with a pretty fine tooth comb, because there's something that's just unique about it that we want to make sure it's right. And this gives us the flexibility to do that, whereas an ordinance that's written with certain specific standards pretty much locks us into something. Depends on what it is. Generally speaking, we go by building code, Iowa building code, but if you're talking more specific, we have the administrator goes out and he checks the buildings, if it's a building permit.
I think you're referring specifically to the pipeline. And to honestly answer that, I don't know, but I don't think Dan's the one that's going to have the oversight over that. That's a question that needs to be asked by every landowner.
Oh, we have someone that knows.
Who gave that authority to the county then? Do you know? Was that the Iowa utility? Okay, okay.
Thank you.
We'll be aware of the scope of the project, so it'll be easy to figure out that it's the pipeline, so.
They're saying a 12 to 24 inch. So I'm pretty sure that I'm in one of the main runs, but what about one of the smaller ones that are, so how do you determine one of those ruptures if it's only an 8-inch line compared to a 24-inch line? And where would you find data on the difference between the 8 and the 24? Because it can't be the same. And how much of the liquid in there is going to be dispersed before a mandatory shut off? You know, I mean, that's just stuff to consider, you know.
That, there again, I'll go back to the conditional use permit. Those are all questions that will have to be answered by the pipeline company
Right.
before, if they can't say yes or no to an answer, or if they can't give us an answer to that and we're not comfortable with their answer, then we have a recommendation we make. There again, like I said, that's where a conditional use permit, I think, would be valuable to use in that situation, because if they don't come up with an answer or an answer that's satisfactory, that's a reason to deny a permit if they can't answer the questions that are being asked them. I think that's a recommendation by this board can be made based on what we see at the time of the permit application.
This whole thing here, CO2 did was put the bubbles in my diet. It's all. And then we all get confronted with this, you know what I mean? And I know more about CO2 than I ever wanted to know in my whole life.
Does that limit then the future use of the land? That once Mobile expanded outside of town. Now, Lawton, obviously, that's really active.
You mean the installation of a pipeline? Yeah, it's gonna have certain hazards or stipulations that follow along with it. So if it gets put there, there's gonna, especially, that's where the setback, if we make the rules with an ordinance and there's a setback, it's black and white. Well, if you're within X feet, you can't do anything. So. Thank you.
This meeting, I feel personally that I see by your guys' expression that you show honest concern about what's going on. And I'm thankful.
And thank you. The comments and the input that you provide and the time that you put into this is appreciated. You all have unique perspectives and provide different information from different viewpoints and experiences. So it's valuable information. We appreciate it. But it's,
back to the process on the conditional use permit. If that's what comes before to the county, it's then presented to the zoning board and we review it. There's opportunity for public to have input. And then we would make a recommendation. We don't grant or deny it. We would make a recommendation to the Board of Adjustment. Then at the Board of Adjustment level is where the input is crucial by the public, by the people affected either negatively or positively. They need to speak up there because that's the information that the Board of Adjustment weighs in what decision they make. And then when they make a decision, that's final. The Board of Supervisors don't even say yay or nay. This was just a setback that I think I'll let Dan handle that because he knows more of what this ordinance was proposed and the setback, because I think it was asked for.
Yeah, yes, as Doyle has mentioned, the Board of Supervisors have directed the staff and the zoning commission to basically look at this issue. Because this is a public hearing, kind of looking at what I initially said was the 1,000-foot planning areas, consultation zones, and the 330 setback from residential, and the 50 for the general industrial and the commercial. That's basically a proposal that is basically on the board here. And the zoning commission could do this a number of ways, report back to they could do a little bit more work or research and table this to another public hearing, or look at recommending this proposal to the supervisors, or not recommending the proposal, or stating that we had looked at the conditional use process, and the conditional use process could facilitate the permitting process. The supervisors did kind of reference it last summer as well, and kind of the initial, for the record, that the staff had suggested was to look at those criteria that I put up on the board before you, and ask for as many folks as possible to help us derive a larger set of questions that you might have. And the concept was to take these questions and bring them to the Board of Supervisors and say, okay, under criteria number 3, it says here, the proposed use and development will not have a substantial or undue adverse effect upon adjacent property, the character of the neighborhood, traffic conditions. Now, based upon that criteria, can you think of any questions we might ask? Possibly? Well, the idea is to generate questions that are rooted into that criteria, and maybe present them to the supervisors, and maybe consider maybe a general resolution that would have them maybe ask the zoning commission as well as the Board of Adjustment to ask those questions. In other words, as you all probably know, a resolution generally is a will or a concept that the supervisors or any elected body is looking for information on. As Tom said, under the current regulation, the supervisors are not involved under the current ordinance. It comes down to zoning commission for the review, Board of Adjustment ultimately make that decision. So based upon what the zoning ordinance is, what's in that criteria, there's a lot of interesting questions that are just out there, kind of doing a brainstorm session that, could be asked. And those are fair questions to be asked when they're directly rooted in the criteria. So it's just a matter of getting to know this concept, because this concept is our ordinance or our law, and we have to root it directly in that to ask the questions. So another perspective would be if the commission wanted to recommend that route to the supervisors on asking maybe for a resolution to ask more specific questions, basically. So really the concept is an ordinance, the 330, that concept, yes or no, or using the existing. So, or postponing. So it's entirely something for consideration.
These seats are available for a 6-year term.
Yeah.
That's going back to how it's handled. If it's a conditional use permit and it's an application for the permit, then no, the supervisors don't vote on it. That's the current way to handle any permit application through a conditional use, would be through us. And then we would make a recommendation, and then the Board of Adjustment would vote on it, and they would have their ruling with all the conditions, and their condition, they can be anything. It could be, it can be applicable to that pipeline in a way that you wouldn't even be able to think of today. But if it's a valid consideration, they may say, if there's a school there, the school has to be 500 feet from that. It has to be 1,000 feet from that. They can place conditions. They're not limited on what they can place on that application. The Board of Adjustment has the authority, if they base it on the information that's brought before them at the time, It's 5. So based on if our recommendation goes to them one way or the other, they can change they don't have to go by what our recommendation is. But if we base it on information that's in front of us and they get the same information that's in front of them, then they have the ability to vote. Yes, and that gives opportunity for the public to come forward, speak in front of them before any decision is made. And like I said, if they make that decision, the only way that the individual or the company that's denied, or if they are denied a permit, then they would have the option to go to court. So it gives you three real layers to deal with it, instead of an ordinance that's written and you just say yes or no. Okay. Yeah, and this stuff, I guess any questions you have, that's what we're here for, so. Yep.
They just like, they take a map and I'm gonna go from here to here. There's all kinds of corridors that are already in existence. There's nothing that says they have to use these utility corridors.
I don't think there's a co-location clause, but that's something that the Iowa Utility Board has established or hasn't, but that's under their control. That's not each and every county that determines that. But I mean, I guess we've dealt with co-location. Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, they were in the 40s and 50s and. Right. Yep. And that, like I said, that might be something that that can be asked of you. I know you said you have, and everyone has addressed Iowa Utilities Board, but you don't stop. I mean, if you.
Stop. Register with them. They don't read everyone. They just put another check by your name that you. And that surprised a lot of us when we heard that. That they don't read every one of them that you can send.
I can't answer. I don't think Dan can either. It's sad, if you got information, they should listen to it too, so. Yep, thank you. That depends on what happens tonight, because maybe, we haven't made a decision yet, but maybe
As a
tonight,
collective
maybe
board
tonight as a board,
or
we'll make a
commission.
decision that will determine that, or again, it can be tabled. It's just, it comes down to what the 5 people sitting up here decide tonight, so.
Speaking of which, if we have no other comments, what do we want to do? What are your thoughts? What do you want to do? Maybe we'll decide.
I guess I feel with the vast differences that we're dealing with on the pipeline, that the conditional use permit can serve us better than adopting an ordinance that may not fit. We haven't, the ordinance is just before us tonight. We haven't dealt with it enough to even know whether it's something we should look at or not, but I'm more comfortable using a conditional use process for pipelines at this time.
Okay, that's a motion.
I guess I would make that motion.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor. Do we have a second?
Could you restate it?
I would make the motion that we stay with our existing process through the conditional use permit for pipelines as opposed to adopting the ordinance with the language that's within it.
Just have a question before that gets called, but I guess the question from an ordinance standpoint would be, obviously, it's a hazardous pipeline ordinance right now as it's proposed, and obviously the side effects that go with that, the reverse setbacks and stuff, but and I'm not opposed to the conditional use permit process that's in place, but I guess the question would be is would it make sense to look at this, or can we look at a CO2 high pressure pipeline specifically in the name of the ordinance, not so you don't get all the other things grouped in there. In which case there may be benefits to looking and having the setbacks in place. So you're not, you know, and that may be something to consider too. Again, not proposing it the way it is. I mean, I have some personal concerns with, you know, an industrial area has more people, not to be callous, but if a household people dies, it's a tragedy, but it's 5 or 10 people, 3 people, 2 people. If an industrial leak occurs 50 feet from Seaboard Triumph and 4,000 people die, that's a little bit bigger issue also. So again, it just, I don't necessarily think that, I just think that as a board, we ought to consider also, not to jump on your thing, I know I'm out of order and stuff, but you know, maybe the ordinance is not the wrong thing to consider it, presuming it's titled right and looks at the right product, not necessarily all pipelines jumbled together. So.
I think that's one thing, Dan, I don't know, can you answer that? Because I kind of asked that before. I understood this to start with. When we first got into it, it was strictly CO2, but can it be split up?
Well,
to where it doesn't apply to any other pipeline other than CO2?
The issue is how the federal classifies hazard liquidus pipelines and then the natural gas. The whole concern is about the preemption issue. There's arguments that the feds would preempt the localities on things from hazard mitigation down to design and even locating for that matter. And that's where the question is whether counties can actually assert that level of zoning and that level of scrutiny. And the Shelby County language has used hazardous liquid pipelines as general. Then you get into the federal regulation, then they branch off into the different aspects or styles there. And so that's definitely a good question when it comes to do you single one out or do you not single one out? And that gets a bit more confusing when you're breaking into the type of hazardous liquid pipeline as the federal calculates them. And so when I get back to the intent on how they originally designed this ordinance and you look through, we don't have very many enumerations in our zoning ordinance except on conditional use, except for maybe the telecommunication towers. And if we go into the telecommunication tower, the danger on extra language inside there is based on the federal preemption. Our current zoning ordinance right now talks about co-location. We've talked about kind of the easements and using the same locations. Well, the state and the federal, all they have to do is pass preemptive legislation. For example, Iowa Code 8C talks about telecommunication towers, and it took away the county's authority to be able to ask a company, did you reach out to a neighboring telecom company and attempt to co-locate on their tower? And they would have to certify that and have an affidavit that would be presented to Zoning Commission and Board of Adjustment. Well, the federal and the Iowa Code 8C did not want that regulation to happen at the local level. So they passed and preempted us. And so we're not allowed to ask certain things in our conditional use as it pertains to the telecommunication tower. And what I'm getting at is the supremacy clause of the federal national government does exist. National security has typically been used as the premise for having interstate pipelines. And the PHMSA regulations that I brought up tonight concerning planning zones and consultation zones is PHMSA's way of saying the local community, the local government, you're not so much getting into setbacks, but here is some language that could be used to create that communication channel. And so what staff did with the premise of the ordinance that we presented was we took things like the planning zones and consultation areas. We see those as meeting federal muster for the most part because PHMSA's all for that. They're for a conversation for the public to know that you're within this zone. And what the planning area does is, I know we had that question earlier on about a subdivision. You want to split off some lots. What the planning area would do in our new proposed language is if this zoning commission were to have a subdivision plat like we did with the first agenda item tonight, we would have to consider with that platting process that those who've subdivided or choose to split that lot tonight, that would have to be enumerated on the plat. They're splitting this lot now. And so these property owners now have to know that they're in a consultation zone or a planning area of 1,000 feet. And so now you would have to get the pipeline company involved and you would have to consider development in a long range pattern. The federal seems fine with that. But what happens is the challenges that we've received public comments, across the board, folks of different viewpoints. The American Petroleum Institute, I believe, put a comment in the record, and they basically cited, again, the federal regulation, the CFR Code of Federal Regulation, where they're specifically talking about that the locality, again, the government here, cannot get involved in the setbacks per se. And so that's where this is all going to be questioned. And that's where I made the statement earlier on about Story County. We're monitoring that very closely because if that case breaks one way or the other, it's going to show possibly the local governments what is capable, what could be done. But with that level of uncertainty there, of asserting a customized setback puts it out there for a type of challenge in a way that would be questioned. And so there's a number of ways to get to court, obviously. Even like they're saying, the third step of the conditional use permit process is if the Zoning Commission Board of Adjustment recommend a condition that they believe is contrary, is that condition constitutional or not? And so with that said, the companies, including potential applicants, talk about the preemption. And so you've all probably seen with the Iowa Utilities Board, yes, they're taking comments for consideration about the placement of that. The way the local governments are generally treated at the county is you could possibly be preempted. And so the question is, and that does remain the big question mark here is, could we be preempted? And so the right away in the language that I've seen, if you mention hazard mitigation or if you mention the distances, they're going to right away point to the federal regulation and the state for being able to cite, and that would likely be the challenge there in court. And so with that said, the classification of the specific pipeline, there is a issue there. Either how do how do you have a top-down or a catch-all approach that fixes the entire scenario? And so that's where the challenge has been, and that's where staff looked for some sound data. When we were charged by the Board of Supervisors, they had said, go out and look and find data. And so the 330 came from that emergency response guide as some place to hang the data hat on. But with that said, the classification of the hazardous liquid pipelines would sort of catch those and definitely have to leave natural gas alone, because natural gas is in the other category. So the question mark is under hazardous liquid, whether the setback can be instituted, but under the natural gas, they will specifically bring up national security issues and the transportation of that interstate, and likely the 50-foot and the various other regulations in the code. And so that, going back to that, this issue has existed for a number of years, and I had mentioned that in the staff report, is that again, the 2008 ordinance was passed under the premise that pipeline must have a conditional use regardless, so that the characteristics of that conditional use are brought to the county as a whole. And it does create that conversation. It's likely that other locations that may not have a robust zoning ordinance may need specific answers to zoning, or in particular. And the other point that I do want to make about zoning too is the Iowa Utilities Board looks at the development plans in particular, and what is the zoning ordinance is a product of the development plan, the will of the people, how we want the county organized, how we want the uses organized, all of those aspects. So the Iowa Utilities Board, being the deciders in the sense on the route and everything, have to look back and see generally where the counties are in terms of the land use, et cetera. And I've tried to look at some of our development maps and talk to some of the cities like Sergeant Bluff to kind of understand where are you expanding out with the residential, and where are the respective pipelines going. Well, the Iowa Utilities Board would likely need to look at those maps, because much of those maps are out on the outer skirts of the Sioux City and the incorporated areas in particular. So when folks address the Iowa Utilities Board, it's definitely imperative to understand the criteria that they have to look at in terms of analyzing the comments and the direction. And the other thing, again, with zoning in general and those criteria that I mentioned up on the board, everything has to be rooted in meaning and data and be backed up. And that's key. And that's what the Commission Board of Adjustment would look at. So kind of going back to the question again, to get back there, implementing something that's specific to hazardous pipelines would catch under the federal designation all of those aspects of the pipelines, but anything that's pre-existing in the ground right now would be share those grandfathering rights, or the legal non-conforming rights, and then we would be kind of left with the results of that as a whole, if something of that nature was put into place designating the setback for the hazardous liquid pipeline.
I wasn't, I guess.
Okay, do we have anything else, board members? We have a motion on the floor.
Don't we?
Yes, we do.
Sorry, Tom.
No problem. Thank you for pointing that out. No?
I would like to second that motion.
Okay, we have a motion and a second.
Can you just read the motion again, please?
I might have with edits here, but, a motion to stay with the existing process with the conditional use permit. Does that sound
Right, instead of going with the
okay?
draft ordinance proposal.
Okay. Instead of going with the draft ordinance proposal.
But I'd like to add that I'd like to see the draft. I mean, I'd like to go through it a little bit more, maybe do a little more research on that. I don't want to totally throw it out if there's some things that we need to look at.
I think this is something that, because it's so new to us, that it's a process that's going to be ongoing. I'm going to
Right,
have
I
to
don't
keep an
want
eye
to-
on it, especially with the other counties that are facing litigation right now. What are they
Right.
learning?
Right.
And what can we learn from them?
And what can we add in the
Right.
meantime? And
What will work best? Maybe there'll be a different solution. Yeah. Okay, so we have a motion, we have a second. All in favor, say aye. Yes, you may.
Kind of more directed at Tom, so it's a motion to stay with the existing process with the conditional use permit instead of going with the draft ordinance proposal. Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay. Motion and second. All in favor, say aye.
aye.
All opposed, same sign.
Barb,
That is our recommendation.
Barb, can I just ask, is that a motion you were going to make also as far as?
No, I didn't want to make a
Okay.
motion. I just wanted to add that in, that we continue to look at this.
We want to let the supervisors know and the public know that this is not done here. This is an ongoing process.
The motion I made and that we voted on and just accepted doesn't preclude us from coming up with some language that would assist in that, correct?
Yeah, and that's something, it could be that could actually be part of a recommendation to the supervisors if a list rooted in the conditional use is created, we could bring it back to the supervisors and ask them for resolution language that would empower all of you to ask further questions, but it would.
And then that way it doesn't end up with the situation where we lump a bunch of rules on existing pipelines. We can go forward with conditional use permit and the process and
That's possible. And the other thing is, it's imperative to watch the other communities and what's been going on with them, including any litigation that's going on, because it will show you what the pathway is in terms of what would meet muster, what would not meet muster. So it looks like that particular motion passed, but if there's another aspect that to add to that could be something that could be considered.
No, I just don't want to drop this off the agenda is what I'm trying to say is I'd like to continue to monitor
Researching
the
and watching.
situation. Does that
like
make
a study
sense?
session to,
Make sure I make deliberate action that makes sense to protect individual rights in the county, but also do what's right for the greater good.
Okay. I'm just kind of thinking out loud a little bit. So is there another statement or something to deliver to the supervisors as the opinion of the zoning commission based on this issue then? Because the motion that came out basically did say staying with this process. And I do have your comments now. I mean, they can direct the commission to come back too. I mean, it's a formalized communication between both boards.
As I said to Chris before, time and as I spoke to Chris before, time and discussion amongst us, I would like more time.
Can it be a standing agenda item or not?
Well, based on that motion, it basically says that the conditional use permit, sticking with the conditional, if you're gonna stick with the conditional use permit process, that's likely fine. And so if you're gonna use that process or would like to also maybe additionally recommend, like the question thing we've talked about, or if you have another process.
I guess I would expand that a little bit then to we need the opportunity to review this language a little bit better and see what we would move forward with for a recommendation for a resolution from the supervisors to maybe add a little guidance in with the conditional use process.
Okay, and there's other things to think about. A lot of research has been conducted. We've received a lot of good information from the public and other sources, and which is in the record. And concepts that we can learn and how they affiliate with the criteria is something that could possibly can be considered, if need be, to make conditions or types of things if they're necessary. So.
Just like say thank you to you too, Dan, for the compilation of data you did give to us. There's no doubt that was mind numbing going through all that, and it really gave a good basis for a lot of the discussion. And you know, it's just it's a lot to swallow on this subject. So.
Okay. Okay, and then the other thing is, this is going to be brought up to the supervisors as a general informational item tomorrow, which means we usually need about a good week because logistically to get on the supervisor's agenda, we've got to submit everything to them by Thursdays. And so with the holiday and everything, I basically put an information item up to just informally tell them what the general path is of the commission, but formally then on a week or so later, your motion to basically stay with the existing process, that's what's going to be pretty much delivered to them verbatim. And so it's kind of up to them at the next point to see which way they would prefer to go. As you know, they can and may not accept recommendations. It just entirely depends upon the route that they would take. So we'll kind of, I guess, report that back to them and I guess go from there.
Okay.
Just so they could adopt the ordinance the way it is written. Is that correct?
They could. This ordinance can definitely be put in front of them, and again, reading the way that this motion is written, to stay with instead of going with the draft, they would still be presented with basically this was a rejection of the draft language at this point. And staying with the current process, they might have a look at this and maybe have a different opinion, and then they could possibly, I'll have to check with the county attorney's office, but to make a determination whether they do public hearings on that language or do something different.
Okay. Okay. So are we ready to move on to the next item, which is informational application process for positions on the Board of Adjustment and Zoning Commission?
Yes. I basically am I'm bringing this up. I brought this up to Board of Adjustment too. Typically, every year, we have one member of the Zoning Commission and Board of Adjustment go off. It's a staggered 5-year term. And what I mean is the term expires. Incumbents can, of course, submit an application. Members of the public, of course, advertisements are put out to potentially apply for it. But ultimately, from the applications, the Board of Supervisors make the selection on who the members are of the Zoning Commission and the Board of Adjustment. And I just simply wanted to bring to light here that The process is we've just got an application that it's filled out if folks are interested in serving in these positions. And the application is just requested to be submitted to the supervisor's office. And December 15th is basically the deadline. And then they typically make the decision in hopefully the end of December, so that the member will be seated for the incoming year, basically. So that's the process. I think since I've been around, many of you have filled out those applications in the staggered year process and kind of went through that. But we do publicize and put it out there that there's, see, every year there's always one opened, unless like that one year when they changed the residency, that created several positions that kind of, I think we operated as 3 there for a while during COVID, and that can be challenging, of course. So that's all I've got. So if you have any questions, please let me know.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last, number 6 is public comment on matters not on the agenda. Do we have any? Seeing none or hearing none, we'll move on to the next one, which is commissioners' comment or inquiries. Do we have comments or inquiries, commissioners? Bedtime, okay. Does that mean move on to the next item on the agenda, which is staff update? Oh, Corey.
I was getting ready to move to adjourn.
Oh, you're skipping through the agenda then. Staff update, anything?
Well, I kind of covered the major updates that this will be an information item tomorrow night at the Board of Supervisors. Again, it's an informal item because it's not enough time to formally present the proceedings that happen tonight to tomorrow. But that will be going to the board as a response, and then we'll kind of see what the next direction would be for staff and the commission.
And I mean, again, I want to thank you for all of the energy and effort and, yeah, like you said, mind numbing work that you put into this. Appreciate it. And then finally, Corey.
Move to adjourn.
I'll second.
All in favor, say aye. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate it again for being here tonight and sticking with us.